Keeping the Sabbath is a concept practically old as the establishment of the Israelites. Many of you can remember, I'm sure, when most stores were closed on Sundays because of the blue laws that were observed throughout this country. And there are places where such observations are still the case. When on a work trip to Switzerland many years ago, I can remember being surprised because everything closed at noon on Saturday and did not reopen until Monday morning. And I understand that outside of public transportation hubs and tourist areas, of course, that is still largely true today. So what does it mean to observe the Sabbath? God established this day of rest in the very beginning of Genesis. For the first 6 days, God created the earth and all of its inhabitants. On the seventh day, God rested. Now, do we really think that God was tired and needed to relax, stretch out in the lazy boy on that seventh day? Probably not. Rather, that seventh day afforded time and space to delight in all that God had created. It can also be a reminder that we are part of the covenant community that God established. And certainly you can argue that is something in which we may all relish. Our surroundings, those we love, those we know gathered around us. In Deuteronomy, God outlines the Ten Commandments for the second time. The context is slightly different each time that these commandments are issued. In Exodus, God has just delivered the enslaved Hebrew people from captivity in Egypt and the threat of death. The commandments were not intended to be obeyed in order to earn salvation or to prove merit. Instead, they were intended to offer instruction in how the people could ensure the freedom they received when they left Egypt. In Deuteronomy, the people were now poised to enter the promised land. And the question is not whether they will be able to stay free, or rather the question is whether or not they will be able to stay free as they undertake a settled life in this new land. And we know the answer to that question. They were not. They engaged in many struggles in this promised land and even endured another very long period of captivity when they were forcibly scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire. Now, in Mark's gospel, we encounter Jesus really at the beginning of his ministry. As he and his disciples travel throughout Galilee, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, healing those in need, and dining with a tax collector, all of those happening just prior to today's passage. And it is indeed this last act, breaking bread with a tax collector, that really draws the attention of the Pharisees. They begin to confront Jesus when he is amongst the people. We have just heard in the gospel reading about two separate run-ins with the Pharisees concerning Jesus' actions on the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples are gathering food so that they might eat on the Sabbath. They are not harvesting any more than they need. Is this really a violation of the Sabbath laws? Jesus reminds the Pharisees that David took bread that only priests are allowed to eat to feed his hungry companions. And if David, God's anointed king, could do this, why is it illegal for Jesus and his disciples? Surely taking care of one's own needs and the needs of others for something as basic as food does not violate the Sabbath laws. And Jesus continues to push these Sabbath laws when he heals the man with a withered hand in the synagogue and on the Sabbath. This time he asked the Pharisees if this is truly a violation. He knows, and the Pharisees know, that according to Jewish laws, saving a life or a soul takes precedence even if it is done on the Sabbath. Now, if the Pharisees had wanted a true discussion about this, they could have asked if the man with the withered hand was actually dying. Could not the healing have waited one more day? But that is not what the Pharisees wanted. They decided to conspire with civil authorities on just how to destroy Jesus instead. But Jesus is stretching the letter of the Sabbath laws to highlight God's intent behind these laws. Now, each of these actions is intended to do good. We should care for others whenever we have the opportunity, even if it is on the Sabbath. Both acts show compassion and demonstrate what it means to love your neighbors as yourselves. Jesus may also be stretching what it means to work. God's commandment to keep the Sabbath holy also challenges us to consider this. For those of you who are retired, what is your work? That may differ for each and every one of you. For those who may not have a traditional job, what is your work? It may include taking care of others. And for those of you who are still active members of the workforce, how do you define work? It may mean more than all of those hours you put in order to receive that paycheck. Is it possible to set aside one day of the week to do no work, as is the traditional definition of Sabbath keeping? So are we feeling a little stretched yet, as Jesus is hoping we will? Now, another way to approach this is to ask what it means to rest. Today, we hear a lot about the importance of self-care. Messages come from many different directions, emphasizing that we do not take adequate care of ourselves so that we can be our very best. We need more rest, more recreation, more exercise, better diets. Undoubtedly, that is true for many of us. I recently had to update my boundary awareness training that is required for pastors who are involved with the congregation and for elders who are involved in the life of the presbytery. This message was emphasized very heavily in each segment of this online course I had to take. Have we forgotten how to create Sabbath time? God asks us, invites us to take time to delight in and enjoy creation as part of this Sabbath keeping. Jesus encourages us to consider ways that we may show compassion for others and for ourselves as we seek to keep Sabbath. So perhaps what we can take from these passages today is that we should seek ways to achieve a whole, rich, and balanced life. Celebrate God's goodness and God's love. Work, if you will, use that word, to show this goodness and love to others. Perhaps we will find opportunities to do just that on the day that we traditionally think of as the Sabbath, this day, Sunday. Undoubtedly, we will find ways to do this all of the other days of the week as well. And maybe we'll find that we have Sabbath moments, which, when they're all put together, will show us that we have found delight in all that surrounds us and demonstrated that same kind of care and compassion for others that Jesus embodies. We have much food for thought as we partake in this holy meal that has been set aside for us this day. To the Lord our God, Alpha and Omega, be all glory and honor forever. Amen.